Hi, my name is Lisa Johnson, and I'm the head of investment law and policy at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And I'm here to do a Q&A relating to my session of this MOOC, which deals with international legal frameworks and their impacts on investments in the extractive industries and governance of those investments. So I have a couple of questions that were sent to me relating to my session, so I'll turn to those. The first one is, to enter into international investment treaties, and for those terminating, amending, or reshaping them, what are they leveraging to be able to do so? So those are two good questions in one. The first one is are countries obliged to enter into international investment treaties? And the answer is no, that countries do not need to sign those agreements, and there are examples of some countries that haven't. So for example, one key example is Brazil. Brazil did sign about 14, I believe, investment treaties, but hasn't ratified any of them. So has no kind of traditional investment protection treaties that are in force. It does have a new model of investment facilitation agreements that it has begun signing and concluding with countries around the world, but it doesn't have the standard model of investment treaty with investor state dispute settlement. So that's one example of a country that doesn't have any investment treaties. And there are many other countries that don't have treaties with a key investment partner. So for example, there is currently no investment treaty between the US and China, or between the US and the UK. So there are a number of country pairs where there aren't investment treaties that exist between the two countries. So there is no obligation to sign an investment treaty. The next part of that question is what is the leverage of countries that are seeking to amend or terminate their agreement or to reshape them? So as I talk about in my session, so the investment treaties, there are about 3,000 of them in force, and then countries really, the first one is typically said to have been signed in 1959, and there are kind of a number of investment treaties. Really, the rush to sign them happened in the 1990s. And the claims under investment treaties, because investment treaties, they give investors the right to sue their host states. And kind of the beginning of the 2000s really saw the start of ISDS claims, these investors suing the governments, an investor state dispute settlement. So the claim started about 15 or so years ago. And the claims have been brought under, for the most part, some of the older agreements, the agreements signed in the 1980s, 1990s. And countries have increasingly realized that those agreements are, they're short, they're vaguely worded, they're open to kind of differing interpretations, and some of them really broad interpretations and interpretations that hadn't been foreseen or intended by the host states or the home states that were party to the agreements. So states have begun kind of coming up with new models and new treaties and signing different generation agreements. I think there are questions of which generation we are now in the investment treaty world, but kind of updated agreements. So with that, then they have been thinking about, well, what do you do with your stock of existing treaties? There's 3,000 treaties that currently exist that are these older, shorter, more vaguely worded agreements. And a couple of answers are to terminate the agreements or to amend the agreements, or to otherwise try to interpret them, to use different interpretive tools to shape their meaning. And in particular for termination and amendment, it might be difficult for a state to get its treaty party to agree to an amendment. The other treaty party might be kind of happy with the way the treaty has been drafted or the way the treaty is being interpreted, and not have an interest in amending. And that is a real issue for some states. Similarly with termination, some states, when they have wanted to terminate the treaty, have agreed with their treaty party on a certain timeline for termination. And the significance of that is, what it means is that the termination can be done so it's effective immediately. Otherwise, if you terminate a treaty unilaterally, there are provisions in the treaties that say, well, they might carry on for another 10 to 15 or 20 years, depending on the language of the treaty. So you can, if you have no leverage, you can terminate unilaterally, but if you can't get your state party to, your counterparty to the treaty to agree, you might be able to terminate with immediate effect. So those are real questions about leverage and what a state can actually do with respect to its existing stock of investment treaties. The worst case scenario would be that you just terminate and then it has to run out its life, which would be another 10, 15, 20 years. So that's that question. The other tool might be for interpretation, where the state just makes a concerted effort to clarify what it means by its investment treaty. So for example, where the investment treaty says that it provides fair and equitable treatment to investors, and that's a guarantee in the investment treaty, that the state can use its powers under international law to try and clarify in advance what it means by fair and equitable treatment and try and narrow the interpretation of that standard if that's its understanding of the agreement. So those were maybe some quick answers about leverage and options. The second question that I had was of stabilization clauses for countries in light of arguments against its usefulness, especially in light of potentials for countries to get windfall revenue during a super cycle. So yeah, the question of stabilization provisions is a complicated one, and then I think it's difficult to answer given different country circumstances and different circumstances and different types of investments. Different investors and different investments might have different demands for stabilization, but you can view stabilization provisions in a way as an investment incentive, as a fiscal incentive that is given to companies in order to try and attract their investments. And one thing about fiscal incentives is that, particularly when the country has a reason why investors want to invest. So for example, it has a large market, or in the case of natural resources, it has natural resources that people are looking to exploit. In those cases, the investment incentive is often kind of additional to the investment decision. The investor will take it and will benefit from it, but it will not be the decision of whether or not the investor actually makes the investment. It's kind of the overall regulatory legal framework, and in particular the value of the resource, the potential of the resource. So in many countries with investments in natural resources, you don't have stabilization commitments being given. And some of my colleagues did a study over a few years ago looking at kind of tax changes or changes in tax regimes governing extractive industry investments during the time with the high commodity prices, because a number of countries during that time did try and change their fiscal regime in order to try and capture a greater share of the benefits. And we saw a number of fiscal changes in developed and developing countries, and many investors said, actually with this change, we might leave, we might decrease our investment, we might invest elsewhere. So those statements were made by investors, but in many countries they did change the fiscal regime, and the investors did not leave. So it's a complicated question to answer in advance, but fiscal stabilization isn't necessary to attracting investments, particularly in the context of investments in natural resources. And there are other, I'm sure the other sessions will talk about it in more detail, but there are other mechanisms such as kind of progressive fiscal regimes that can adjust with circumstances and over time that do provide more long-term certainty both to the investor and to the state, and try and ensure that the benefits and the benefits of the treaty and the way they're distributed adjust on their own with changing circumstances depending on commodity prices. So those are the questions that I received, and hopefully that was useful and not too quick. But thank you very much for your questions.